Hello, beautiful people. My name is Kristen. Thank you for taking time stopping by my channel. Today, I am talking about nonfiction. This is inspired by Nonfiction November that is hosted by the beautiful Olive at A Book Olive. I will leave her video announcement talking about that below. This is not a video to recommend nonfiction based off of her prompts for this year, although I do see ways to tie in many of these books into those prompts. These are the top 10 nonfiction books that I will even rank in order for my all-time favorite nonfiction. What I used for guidelines to determine these was how did I feel or learn or engaged while I read the book? How did it stick with me? Did I continue to think about the book? And thirdly, did I actually apply things that I had learned or experienced or felt from the books and changed behaviors or done something differently with my life into it? And then I realized when I looked at the books that I had assembled, this is a really personal video. It's like this becomes your identity almost and gives insight into kind of what does drive us. And that's part of the awesome joy of discovering books, right? It's like, what is it that really engages us and teaches us and challenges us? So when I looked at the stack of books, I realized that they all have in common many things, which I will talk about at the end if you want to stick with me. But how I'm going to share them with you is I will show you the book. I will read the first sentence or maybe paragraph or two, tell you what the book is about, and then tell you briefly how it touched or affected my life and why I have it on this list to see if it's something that maybe you want to give some further thought to as well. I will start out with the first book. It is called Pre, which is the story of America's greatest running legend, Steve Prefontaine, by Tom Jordan. So this starts out, there was something about Steve Prefontaine that demanded attention. As a writer for track and field news in the early 1970s, along with just about everyone else in the track world, I was fascinated by the phenomenon known as Pre. His was a nature brash, fearless, outspoken, and in the United States at least, invincible on the track. To hear him hold forth to the media was to listen to a machine gun locked on automatic fire. To watch him back up his talk on the track was a thrill for his admirers and a frustration to his competitors. Either you were a Pre-fan or you were not, and I was a fan. So it's a short little running book biography on this runner in the 70s. And the reason why it became so important to me is I have a son and he was a competitive runner. So all through starting when he was 9, he started racing and discovering that he loved the competition of race. And over on multiple occasions, people would compare him to Pre, and he actually looked a little bit like Pre. I can scoot over and stick a picture, try to put a running picture of my son. So he would have this grit and determination, particularly at the end, where he would just be all in and just running all out. And this is that story. And I just really, that just touches something in my core. You know, when you have to dig deep and push a little harder, I have a hard time personally struggling doing that. And I get inspired by others who do that so well and just am in awe and just really became a fan of not only Pre, but of my son and his running. The second one, just pure coincidence, also has to be a running book, and that is Run the Mile You're In. This is by Ryan Hall. He is an Olympian marathoner, and he wrote 26 chapters, each one for the marathon mile, and it's different inspirations of his life and philosophy of running, if you will. So mile 1, vision. I remember the image vividly, the sparkling bright blue water of Big Bear Lake in the high mountain region of Southern California. Because I'd grown up in these mountains, I'd taken in this image often, but this time it was accompanied by a vision. I was 13 years old, 8th grade basketball player, one who seemed to be stuck on 4'11" and 99 pounds. And despite being one of the hardest workers on the team, I wasn't seeing much playing time. But that didn't keep me from enjoying being part of the team and observing our weekly games from the sidelines. On this particular winter travel trip, the van was full of rambunctious junior high boy energy, the kind that would give most adults a headache. But I found myself tuning out the chaos and gazing at Big Bear Lake. It was as if all the commotion couldn't penetrate my ears. All I could hear was God giving me a desire I'd never had before. I felt like he was giving me the aspiration to run around the lake. The desire wasn't overly obvious. It was more as if I had an itch that could only be relieved by attempting this feat. So, of the 10 books on my list, 3 are Christian-based or faith-based, which is interesting because I think faith plays out in all of them, but only 3 are Christian. This would be one of the Christian-based books. He goes very much in depth about being raised in the Christian tradition and just how he experienced God throughout his running career, which I've only run 1 marathon. I just had a memory pop up in my Facebook that it had been 13 years since I ran the marathon. So it's like on this day, 13 years ago, it's like, oh my gosh, but I don't plan to run another one, but it was totally life-changing. So that is one way that book influenced and pushed me, because I was training for the marathon when I first read it. And so him being a marathoner and his experiences and me being Christian as well, that just tied it in and made that whole experience of many hours of training and running even more special. The next book is A Street Cat Named Bob. This is by James Bowen. And I originally read this book and immediately started following this cat on social media. He has since passed from an accident. And so his legacy lives on. There is even a park with a statue, but this is the original memoir. Chapter 1. There's an old adage I read somewhere. It says, each of us is given second chances every day of our lives. They're there for the taking. It's just that we don't usually take them. I spent a significant chunk of my life proving how true those words are. I was given lots of opportunities, sometimes on a daily basis. For a long time, I failed to take any of them. But then, in the early spring of 2007, that finally began to change. It was then that I befriended Bob. Looking back on it, something tells me it might have been his second chance too. So, sorry, I just lost my cat. And so cats are just always been really special to me. And this book really changed my eyes in the fact of how James was not homeless, but very down on his luck and struggling, just really dealing with so many issues and trying to keep stability within his life. And this cat comes along and he has to befriend and commit to the cat. And he does a lot of his income was doing street music. And so before reading this book, I would enjoy street musicians. But after this book, it gave me a whole new perspective of kind of who they were and insights into what their lives may be like. And always I think about if I have any cash on me, which, we don't always do, but if I do, I now absolutely tip the street musicians. And that's actually a change of behavior based on reading this book and this account of just the struggle and the growth and the love for a cat, which I really resonate because I'm a cat person. Next on the list, 7 is Losing My Voice to Find It by Mark Stuart. And it starts out, The Arena. My childhood church was planted in the rural Indiana town called Richland, named after the fertile soil that surrounded it. My father was the preacher and a singer, and I learned about God somewhere between the two. In the wide open spaces of Indiana bean and cornfields, I would pray with full confidence for ways to tell of God's goodness. I had little doubt that he would deliver. So this is the memoir of a young man growing up in the Christian church, finds that he is a very talented singer himself, becomes the lead singer for a Christian rock band, travels around, and comes into a mysterious disease that basically threatens his voice. And then what does he do with it? How does he adjust? What choices does he have to make? All those kind of good things. And so this is the number 2 out of the 3 on my list that are actually Christian focused books. I think if you have interest in the music industry, you would still maybe enjoy this, but I do think you kind of have to have an appreciation for the specific subgenre of Christian music and just how that struggled and started out, quite frankly, horrible in the beginning of its infancy, and how this is the time of the 90s, which were kind of that, to me, kind of peak time where the Christian bands were really coming into their own and getting their own recognition, starting to cross over onto the secular channels. And so I was a huge fan of Audio Adrenaline, or Audio A for short, which is his band. I absolutely saw him, went to his concerts. I met him in person backstage because I was a youth pastor. Well, I still am a youth pastor, and just spent time getting to know so much of the backstory at the time. And I found myself reading this, I would talk to the book out loud, like, I was there, or, oh my gosh, I remember that. I forgot about that. And I would just laugh. I would just get so emotional because I remember one particular concert in particular, they called all the youth pastors back, and we laid hands and prayed for his voice to hold during the concert because he was struggling with his voice. So this is just very personal to me, and very much kind of, I feel like I was in the book without being in the book, but it was just a fun read. And I would be interested, if somebody wasn't familiar with that band, what their experience of reading the book is it as powerful? Because I thought it was good. Next, number 6 is Between the World and Me by TaNehisi Coates. This little sweet book starts out, Son. Last Sunday, the host of a popular news show asked me what it meant to lose my body. The host was broadcasting from Washington, D.C., and I was seated in a remote studio on the far west side of Manhattan. A satellite closed the miles between us, but no machinery could close the gap between her world and the world for which I had been summoned to speak. When the host asked me about my body, her face faded from the screen and was replaced by a scroll of words written by me earlier that week. The host read these words for the audience, and when she finished, she turned to the subject of my body, although she did not mention it specifically. But by now, I am accustomed to intelligent people asking about the condition of my body without realizing the nature of their request. Specifically, the host wished to know why I felt that white America's progress, or rather the progress of those Americans who believed that they are white, was built on looting and violence. Hearing this, I felt an old and indistinct sadness well up in me. The answer to this question is the record of the believers themselves. The answer is American history. This little book, less than 200 pages, is a letter to his son explaining his feelings on what it is to grow up a Black man in America. And I think I had read several books, that became very popular trying to help heal the racial divide and wounds. But this book is definitely the standout for me. I think because it is written as a letter to his son. It is written in a way that really goes to the heart of the matter of the feelings and what it needs to stand firm. He's writing it from a perspective of how do you make something better out of that? How do you maintain integrity in the midst of things that just aren't fair? That life is, not always a even playing field. And just helped me, a white woman, understand a little bit more deeply what that would be like. Next is A Stone of Hope by Germain. And this, interesting, is flowing a little bit out of that last book. This is a memoir written, I forgot to read the beginning. This one starts out, it has a picture of him as a little boy, his school picture, front row seat September 2000. As the aircraft descended, I pushed my 10-year-old face up against the tiny window, enthralled to the light, flickering orange, yellow, and red. A planetary system down there. Beautiful, bright jewels sprinkled in the dark sky, millions of candles stretching out past the horizon. It was such a stark contrast to where I'd come, a town called Bon Repos in La Plaine, Haiti, where most of the population lives in darkness. So he comes as a 10-year-old boy. He's in Brooklyn in the no nice part of town, has a lot of gang activities and things going on that offer him a lot of choices that he can make. He does come across a couple inspirational people in his life that allow him to see something brighter for his future, goes on to higher education, starts pursuing law and getting involved in some politics. And again, is just that account of what does it mean to be Black in the United States? What does it mean to be an immigrant in this case? I also just had a lot of time to continue to reflect. I have led several missions around the world. The poorest, most desperate situation I have ever personally laid my eyes on was Haiti. And so understanding one more piece of that story and that opportunity was just really powerful for me. Number 4, Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. This is the account of the crew team from Washington State in competing in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. So it starts out, prologue. This book was born on a cold, drizzly, late day when I clambered over the split rail cedar fence that surrounds my pasture and made my way through wet woods to the modest frame house where Joe Rance lay dying. I knew only 2 things about Joe when I knocked on his daughter Judy's door that day. I knew that in the mid-70s, he was single-handedly hauled a number of cedar logs down a mountain and hand-split the rails and cut posts and installed all 2,224 linear feet of the pasture fence that I had just climbed over. A task so Herculean, I shake my head in wonderment whenever I think about it. And I knew that he had been one of 9 young men from the state of Washington, farm boys, fishermen, and loggers, who shocked both the rowing world and Adolf Hitler by winning the gold medal in 8-oared rowing at the 1936 Olympics. So this is a account, it feels very documentary style. It has a lot of pictures and goes into the different lives of the different boys. We get to learn about who they are, where they come from, how do they work together, how do they get over having to work together and live together and be in close quarters. Also coming of age as a college age group of young boys, and dealing with the events and politics even that were going on in the world at the time. So this book was just super engaging, on the edge of your seat. I mean, you kind of know from the beginning that they go to the Olympics and do well, right? But just how they get there and the struggle and the journey, you're still waiting on the edge of your seat going, is this going to be a success moment or a learning curve moment? And I was so inspired by this because I was living outside of DC at the time, and I would go into Washington, DC to run and to train for my running. And I would see the crew teams out on the Anaconda, and the river just called to me. I said, you know what? I can do that. I want to do that. So I used my vacation and I divided it up over weekends because I normally work weekends. And I took a 6-week crew class that was on Saturdays and Sundays for 6 weeks. And I learned how to crew. And it was amazing. It was physically exactly what I wanted it to be. It was challenging. It was inspirational. And I probably won't ever do it again, but I appreciate it all the more. And I just feel like this book just really gave me such good insights and, you know, gave me that experience to actually crew myself. Number 3 is and 2 by Rafe Bartholomew. And it starts, Saturday mornings were my twisted version of heaven. I was 5, 6, 7 years old, and every weekend I got to spend a few hours hanging out with grown men. Not just any men, but characters. Working men, old men, homeless men, policemen, firemen, men who cursed and spat and groaned and who broke each other's chops and answered insults with a right here and a handful of crotch. They were also doting fathers, occasional criers, poets, but those things didn't seduce me back then. Men with names like Frank the Slob, whose last name, Slavinsky, was itself slovenly. Names like Fat Sal and Johnny Wad and Dead Eddie and Buggerman. If I was lucky, I might catch a glimpse of Bung Toe Thompson. So, this is the account of a young man whose father works in this bar, McSorley's in New York City, and it is the longest standing open bar there by some measurements, and it didn't even close during Prohibition. So we have his journey following through with his dad working there, and then he goes on to work there, and he's not only kind of telling us about his history. I loved hearing the stories about his family, his grandfather, beautiful chapter on his mother, just learning about him, but also learning about these people who would come through during times of war. And they would talk about what is it like in this kind of Irish pub when it is St. Patrick's Day, when it's the Super Bowl. And it's called 2 and 2 because at McSorley's, you can only order 2 at a time. You can't order 1. It's 2 at a time. So it's like the light or the dark. What do you want? And I particularly was just struck at the end about this kind of legacy and about this kind of stories and storytelling and sharing. And I started gifting this book to people. This isn't the original copy. I like passed that on and got another library version here for myself. But I just love this concept of a place and then the people passing through and sharing those stories. And so it just inspires me and calls to me to not be afraid to necessarily talk to a stranger or to strike up that conversation, and to respect it if you're getting the feeling that you're intruding, right? But I just feel like those kind of encounters, those kind of connections are just really resonate with this. And I loved how he tied in family. I loved how he tied in history of place and symbolism of that, and how that became like inspirational hope during times of war. September 11th is talked about in here. So just really, really powerful stuff. Speaking of powerful things, number 2 on my list of all-time favorite nonfiction, Beneath the Tamarind Tree by Isha Sesay. This starts out, Chapter 1. The singing was so soft at first, I thought my mind was playing tricks. I stopped unpacking my frayed leather duffel and stood completely still. With my head half cocked, my neck craning, I waited, expectant, in my bare hotel room. Then I heard it again. This time, the haunting melody of voices filling the air was unmistakable. But who was singing? I was in Yola, northern Nigeria, in December 2016, counting down the hours till I set off on a pilgrimage of sorts to witness the long-awaited return of the 21 Chibok girls. Just a few weeks earlier, much of the world had been stunned by their sudden release. After years in Boko Haram captivity, now the girls were finally returning to families and to a community desperate to welcome them back to the very place from which they had been stolen. Their homecoming was underway, and I am covering the emotional journey for CNN. So she is a CNN correspondent that documents her journey with these girls. It was actually 279 girls that were kidnapped by a militant group because they were in school, right? That was considered not what this militant group thought was proper or okay or appropriate. And so they took these girls in the dead of night. And so this story actually documents 4 different specific of the girls that were kind of in different groups and having different experiences. And then it continues to show Isha's viewpoint as the reporter and what things happened when over the years and over time. And this book just really, I read it and I listened to it on audio because it is narrated by the author herself. So I highly, highly recommend listening to it in her own words. Just the emotion of it, just thinking about the politics, about the situations, about human survival and spirit, just world connectedness. I was renewed to continue to check out other events outside of my own country. After reading this, I started doing research and following up on many of the incidences around this and around the Boko Haram group, militant group. So many of these groups, unfortunately, are still active, including that one. And just when do we pay attention to it and when do we not? You know, as the reporter, she would like give us a perspective of what would make the news and what doesn't. And that's the part where I think it made me really think and process. It's like, what is the news and what is value and what do we do? How do we not become so overwhelmed because there's always too much news? You know, how do we pick which things are something that maybe we can have an answer to, and maybe it's not anything has to be big, maybe it's just something little. So number 1 on my list of nonfiction is the Holy Bible. So this is actually somewhat of a cheat because it's actually 66 books, right? But if I'm totally honest, which I am with you, the book that has touched my life and shaped my life the most, nonfiction book, is absolutely the Bible. This particular one, so this book starts out, in the beginning, God created. In the beginning, God created. And I just think that is a fantastic beginning. That is absolutely the beginning heartbeat of the relationship that God has with us, that He created you, that you are beautiful. That's, and I know beautiful is sometimes termed to females only, but when we're talking about spirit, when we're talking about creation, it's good, it's beautiful, and you are beautiful. This story is definitely one of many, many parts, but at the root of them, if you're reading behind what is the nature of God, what is the nature of Jesus, and how does that affect and apply, and then I apply that to my life, that makes all the difference in the universe to me. I think about this book, I feel and resonate when I'm reading this book, so this is definitely my number 1 nonfiction book in my top 10 nonfiction of all times. And especially with the Bible on top, it then kind of has me reflect on each of these. All of these have in common this common thread of hope for me, of stories and human spirit connectedness, of coming above this one and coming above human ideas about what is success or what is humanity, and looking for that seed of restoration, looking for that healing, looking for that resurrection, looking for that hope that remains in the midst of things that are really, really difficult. And I think over time, as I look at the books that really connect with me, that is why, that is the underlying thread that I believe, that is kind of the defining identity that makes me run and continue to try to reach out to those places in the world that I can, even if it's just one small little thing or one small little corner. Just like, how can there be that one stone of hope, right? How can there be that one moment of understanding or connectedness, even if it can't last? There's the hope and the reconciliation and the restoration. Those are the books. Hope that maybe this inspired you, if not to pick up these specific ones, just to pick up something that inspires and encourages you this day. Think about, what is it that you think is a top nonfiction book? I do have at least 10 more where I learned something in particular that was really, really interesting. I could do a second top 10 videos of books that taught me or whatnot. So you can leave me a comment if you're interested in that. Maybe I can do that during Nonfiction November. But thank you for stopping by, spending some time. Let me know in the comments what you're reading, and I will see you again soon. Happy reading, y'all.